I've got something a little crazy to tell you. Come here. A little closer. Too close. Back up. All right. So you know the Crusades? That period in history that is constantly used to browbeat and what about and moralize to Christians to make it clear to us that we are in fact the bad guys in history. Well, contrary to what your high school history teacher or your college professors taught you, those did not in fact happen in a vacuum. That's a myth. There was no random group of knights that just, for no particular reason, decided to get together one day, round up 100,000 of their best friends, and randomly go slaughter Muslims all across the Middle East. In fact, the Crusades were actually preceded by hundreds of years of violence, multiple centuries of Islamic expansion, of wars, of constant raids, of populations being kidnapped, murdered, enslaved, and so on and so forth, that ultimately provoked the Crusades, when Christians in Europe could take it no longer, and the East, the Byzantines, reached out to them for help, and they responded. So we have talked about Muhammad, where the conflict between Islam and Christianity kind of began. Not kind of, where it did begin. And we talked about how things really kicked off under the 4 rightly guided caliphs. And now we are going to move into the next period today, the second major caliphate in history, the Umayyads. Stay tuned. Thank you guys so much for coming back to the channel today. If you learned something in this video, I would greatly appreciate you leaving a like. Hey, leave me a comment as well. Let me know what you think I did well, what you think I could improve on, or just tell me what a horrible person I am and how wrong I am. That is also appreciated. If you like this series or the other videos that I have on my channel, please subscribe. Please follow and help me grow. And you can also follow me over on X. I'll put my link in the description to this video. And with that out of the way, let's get back to the main topic of discussion. So far, we have done some pretty in-depth videos on the summary of the life of Muhammad, and then his first 4 successors, the Rashidun Caliphs. And I can hear you saying, Chase, I thought this whole series was supposed to be about learning enough about Islam to learn about its place in America today and what we should feel about it, and how you, from a conservative Christian perspective, what you think the path should be moving forward. And yes, I've gone further into this topic than I meant at first, but I think it's good. It's helping me learn and make sure I really understand these things better. But also it really gives a lot for you guys to really build a foundation of understanding upon. But today, I understand, we're getting there. We're getting to the United States. So we have really spent some time on the beginning. We're going to start to hit the fast forward button. So today, I'm going to follow that same template that I did in the previous video in part 4, where I kind of talked about the sequence of events in the actual timeline first, and then we'll go back and kind of talk about some specific concepts relevant to that period. So I'm going to do that, only today we're not going to spend a lot of time. We're going to do an actually quick, down and dirty coverage of this period, and we're going to do the same thing with the next couple periods as well, because otherwise we will never get there. So the Umayyad Caliphate. I took a couple Arabic classes, fun fact, in college. So I'm kind of like the yellow belt, where like he's been exposed to it just a little, and so he thinks he knows more than he does. So I try to do these pronunciations justice, but I'm probably way off, to be honest. But anyways, so this is a period that follows immediately after the Rashidun. So with the death of Ali and his son Hassan in 661, his son Hassan being picked to be his successor, at least amongst his local supporters over in Iraq, Muawiyah takes this opportunity to move into the area with an army of his own, convinces Hassan, they make some kind of deal and convinces Hassan to abdicate, which leaves the throne open for Muawiyah. So Muawiyah ascends to the throne and becomes the actual 5th caliph and the first Umayyad caliph, or the first caliph of the Umayyad period. Now, if you'll remember, there actually has technically been an Umayyad caliph before, and it was the 3rd caliph, Uthman. And he was assassinated, which kind of kicked off this whole movement. So the Umayyads, if you'll recall, was... How many times am I going to say that right? They were another clan within the Quraysh tribe. So remember, Muhammad belonged to the Quraysh tribe, but he was from the Hashimi clan, or the Hashemite clan. The Umayyads are kind of like his cousins. So they are same tribe, different clan. Well, now it's their time to shine. So they take over with Muawiyah, and he takes over in 661 and has a good reign for about 19, 20-ish years until the year 680. And there's a big change. So up until this point, when it's going from one caliph to the next, there's been a little council get together and they hold a vote. Well, throughout this period of Muawiyah reigning and, doing a fairly good job keeping things together for the Muslims, he has an idea and he begins to win support for his son, of all people. And what ends up happening is there is still a vote, but it's very clearly heavily weighted in favor of his son, Yazid. So when Muawiyah I dies, his son, Yazid I, takes over rulership of the caliphate and begins a new process of hereditary succession, just like monarchs and emperors that we've known throughout all of history. So that has been a departure from the initial method, which was consensus. So now it's hereditary succession for the position of caliph, the leader, the political and religious leader of the Muslim world. And this doesn't go over so well, and we kind of bookend Muawiyah's life. So his reign began with winning the first fitna, and now, just after his death, the ascension of his son to the throne kicks off another fitna, another civil war. So this one lasts for a lot longer, and it actually lasts beyond the reigns of a couple of caliphs, and it will go on for 12 years. So from the year about 680 until about 692. So we're not going to go over all the caliphs in this dynasty because there's 14 of them. The Rashidun, it was kind of more justifiable to really get into some of the details of them because they may come up at different points as we kind of discuss other things in Islamic history. But these guys, it's not that they don't matter. There might be one or two that we talk about a little bit, like I just mentioned, Muawiyah. But the main focus is going to be kind of on the general direction that things are going. So there are essentially, so you got tribe, you got clan, now you got houses. So Muawiyah, his son Yazid, and then Yazid's son, Muawiyah II, all come and go. Those last two have pretty short reigns. Yazid only reigns for about 3 years, and then Muawiyah only reigns for the second only reigns for a few months, and dies of some kind of, most likely, plague, and was a fairly young guy. So this is right in the middle of this big civil war kicking off. So the first one was between East and West. It was between, essentially Ali in the East with his supporters versus Muawiyah in the West with Syria and Egypt and his supporters over there. And it was over the issues of they were mad because Uthman, a member of the Umayyad clan, was murdered. And the people who murdered him got to cast votes, and that's how Ali came to power. And then he refused to punish the assassins, which kicked off the whole war. So now a lot of these similar camps have seen this Muawiyah I's death as a chance to rise up and try to take over the caliphate. And so the first one is one of Ali's sons. There's a couple different factions that pop up in this war. The first one is Ali's other son. So there was Hassan, but now there's Hussein. Keep it straight here. So Hussein has a brief run trying to raise an army, but the Umayyads move against him and kind of squash him before he really gets a lot of followers to his support, and they kill him pretty early on in the war. And there's a little bit of fallout from that, but the Umayyads crushed that one pretty quickly. Well, there's a second faction that crops up, and they follow a guy named Abdallah ibn al-Zubair. So we're just going to call him al-Zubair. And he declares himself caliph down in Mecca, and that's kind of where his base of power is. And he lasts for a lot longer, and at one point, the majority of the caliphate actually acknowledged, at least nominally, acknowledged his leadership instead of the Umayyads. But he is ultimately defeated as well. And then the last faction that comes up again to just continue to be a thorn in the side of the rulers is the Kharijites. So they were a pain in Ali's side, and now they are a pain in the Umayyads' side. So they are causing trouble. At one point, they conquered a bunch of territory, kind of in Arabia and some in Persia, and they were kind of working with al-Zubair, but they are all ultimately defeated, and the Umayyads, after 12 years, managed to hang on. However, Muawiyah's line ends, and leadership passes to... I don't think it actually ends altogether. I think they just power shifts to, because it was going to be another young kid that was going to take over, or at least a young man take over. So power actually shifts to another family within the Umayyad clan. And the first group was the Sufyanids, named for their patriarch, Abu Sufyan, who was a Muslim convert during Muhammad's time. He was him and his son Muawiyah. That was Muawiyah's father. So I know I'm throwing a lot of strange names out at your names that you're not used to. But that line ends after just 3, and then Marwan the first becomes caliph and continues out for the remainder of the Umayyad period. So he comes to power in 684 after Muawiyah II dies of natural causes. And he also has a very brief reign, but he hands it off to... He kind of sets the stage for his own son to take over about a year later. So his second son is the one that is really worth noting, or one of the couple that are really worth noting. And his name is Abd al-Malik. And he reigns for about 20 years, from 685 until 705. And he sees the Umayyads to victory in the second fitna, so they win under his leadership. And there's a lot of conquests going on. There's some expansion. They're continuing to push the empire west, and they take it all the way across North Africa. This is not necessarily all under his leadership specifically, but this direction begins under al-Malik's leadership. And so they ultimately conquer all of North Africa and will eventually invade Spain. And they conquered almost all of Spain and begin conducting raids deep into France, and even take over some towns kind of in the border region, kind of southern region of France, and really start to push into Europe from the west. Well, under Muawiyah the first, the successful one, he actually launches an attempted siege on the city of Constantinople. So while there's that momentum going to the west, he actually has a multi-year siege. It was like, I want to say it was like 4 or 5 years. It was from like 673 or 74. And I think they finally lifted the siege in 678, if I recall correctly. But it ultimately fails. And it's Constantinople from this point on becomes a major roadblock for the expansion, for Islamic expansion. So they are trying to get into Europe, and they're trying to either do it from way out west, or they're trying to do it from way out east. And there's some raids that go on throughout all the coastal regions, but that's really their main directions that they are trying to, there's some armies and stuff that might land here and there and cause some trouble, but those are the main efforts. One way out west, one way out east. Western front and eastern front here. So for the next several centuries, Constantinople, even though the Romans at this point had just been experiencing defeat after defeat after defeat at the hands of the Muslims, they managed to hold and have successful defensive victories in the city of Constantinople. So there is a second attempt on Constantinople later on in the Umayyad period, and that happens in 717 to 718, and is a pretty significant defeat against for the Muslims, as the Umayyads' power is beginning to wane a little bit, and things are starting to go wrong for them. So that eats up a lot of their manpower. It destroys a lot of their navy, and they ultimately fail a second attempt at taking Constantinople. And there's going to be caliphs through the ages, that over the next several centuries, that every so often another one's going to get a big army up, get a big navy up, and try to make another play for Constantinople. But it won't be until ultimately the Ottoman Empire in the year 1453 that they are finally successful, and they conquer Constantinople. And we'll get into what happens in the Ottoman episode. But anyway, so that's the main two thrusts there. Meanwhile, way out east, they are pushing into... Oh man, I always got to look at this. These are some older names. So, you know, obviously we've been calling Iraq Mesopotamia. We know it as Iraq today, but for much of history it was called Mesopotamia. But they push deeper into Central Asia, which is Transoxiana. I'm probably saying that wrong. Transoxiana or Transoxiana? It's Central Asia. It's all the like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, a lot of the different Stan countries out there. So that region, for the majority of that region, falls under the Caliphate's control. And then they also push into what is today Pakistan, or at the time was called Sindh. And they begin to advance into India a little bit. So the empire at this point is so large, and we mentioned it last episode, but it is so large, it's actually, the land area it covers is 15% more land mass than the total land mass of the United States today. That is massive. And they conquer all that in less than 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Very, very remarkable, very rapid gains. The Umayyads are having to rule this massive area. So that's going to bring up some different things we're going to talk about in the concepts. But I'm going to keep things moving. I almost got distracted there and started talking about the Arabization is something we're going to talk about in a little bit of detail. But for now, so they continue this expansion, but as they get into the 700s, things start to go wrong. There's kind of some rapid succession of leaders here. They get a number that just rule for a couple years, and then it passes on. And there's greater and greater discontent with Umayyad rule, a lot of these policies that we'll talk about here in just a moment. And there is, really briefly, there is a noticeable Arab supremacy that is developed that wasn't as prevalent at first, but has been steadily developing as they have expanded and asserted themselves as the rulers over this whole territory. So Arab Muslims are the elites of society, and everyone else, even Muslim converts, are underneath them. And sometimes there is little that separates the dhimmis, the people of the book that are tolerated, but they have to pay special taxes and whatnot. Again, we'll talk about that more as well. But there are a couple of classes now that have formed in society, and it begins to create this simmering situation of widespread discontent with the rulers that will ultimately result in the Abbasid revolution, or the Abbasid uprising, and they will ultimately be successful. They rise up in the 740s, and they will ultimately be successful, and they will crush the Umayyads in the year 750. The caliph at the time, the final Umayyad caliph, is a man by the name of Marwan II. He is defeated in battle in Mesopotamia, and he flees to the west. It is captured in Egypt and executed. So with that, the Abbasids continue their momentum, and they start rounding up all the Umayyads and just slaughtering them. So that particular battle, I want to say it was the Battle of the Zab. It's named after a river or a little tributary in Iraq, around the Euphrates there. Euphrates or the Tigris, one of the two. I can't remember for sure. But they slaughter the Umayyads, except for one. I believe his name is Abd al-Rahman. He manages to survive and escape. And he actually, Abd al-Rahman. Sorry, I just didn't highlight his name. So he is a prince. He's about 19 years old at the time that all this is unfolding. He gets on a ship and he escapes. And he flees westward all the way out to what is now Muslim Spain, or Al-Andalus is what they call it. And he takes over control, and by 756, just a few years later, he establishes what comes to be called the Emirate of Cordoba. So if you remember when we discussed the Rashidun Emirate, you've got this system of governance, these districts and stuff that are that make up different levels of government. So the Caliphate's the entire country, the entire empire. That's broken up into multiple provinces. A province has a governor over it, so it's kind of analogous to American states. And then you have numerous divisions within each province, which are roughly analogous to counties in the United States, within a state in the United States. But those counties aren't called counties; they're called emirates, or I believe that's right, or maybe just districts. But I think emirates, because they are ruled by emirs or junior governors. Well, he establishes it first as the Emirate of Cordoba in what's Spain at the time. But there's one important note here. It essentially breaks off from the rest of the caliphate. So because of, the Abbasids now take over control from 750 onward, and he's an Umayyad, so they are out for his butt. And he, consolidates power there, and the United Kingdom of Islam, if you will, falls. Well, doesn't fall, but it's no longer united. There's now, from this point on in history, with the end of the Umayyad Caliphate, this is also the end of the united Muslim world. From this on, there's always going to be different divisions, different groups here and there. There will still be one primary caliphate that's kind of the most legitimate, or like the main primary power that is recognized. So it goes from the Rashidun to the Umayyads to the Abbasids. And the Abbasids are going to have it for a good long run. And then eventually they will be succeeded by the Ottomans. And we'll talk about those in the next couple videos. But this emirate would, a couple centuries later, in the 900s, would declare itself its own caliphate. So you'll have the Abbasid Caliphate in the east, and then you'll have the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba in Spain. And ultimately, this one will fall to the Spanish Reconquista in the 1400s. So long series of battles between the native Spaniards and the Muslim ruling elites at that time. So that is the Umayyad Caliphate in a nutshell. Let's talk about some of those noteworthy concepts and policies. We mentioned a couple episodes back that Islam is in the very first episode, that Islam is what's called a universal religion. It's supposed to be something that's not just ethnic. It's supposed to be for all of mankind. A lot like Christianity. Well, at the time, I mentioned Arabization just a second ago. During this time in history, there was a series of policies put into place that really began to solidify that Arab identity and began to really just dig them deeper and deeper as the elites of society in the caliphate above everyone else. And even it caused a lot of frustration with, in particular, Muslim converts who were not Arabs. So, for example, I guess the Turks weren't there just yet, but like the Persians, for example. So Persian converts, Persians are not Arabs. Persian converts to Islam, they were kind of kept as a second-class citizen, even though you get verses like this in the Quran, which says, this is Surah 49, verse 13, which says, "O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female, and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. And verses like this are supposed to really reinforce this idea of you're supposed to be united. It's supposed to transcend. Remember the Ummah. You're supposed to transcend national boundaries. You're supposed to transcend ethnicities and tribes. And you are united by your Islamic faith, your submission to God. Well, that wasn't really going according to plan, at least during the Umayyad period, because there was the Arabs on top. There was what the non-Arab converts, which came to be called Mawalis, and they were kind of a second class below them. And then below everybody is the dhimmis. The dhimmis, which dhimmi means protected. These are the tolerated peoples of the book. So primarily Christians and Jews, but there were some Zoroastrians that were also included in there. They kind of they got in on a technicality, but they are, we'll talk about them more in a second, but they are like the bottom rung of society. And earlier on, they enjoy a little bit more wiggle room and even hold some fairly significant positions of influence and power and succeed in spite of maintaining their religious faiths and not submitting to Islam, at least not converting to Islam. They still submit to their Islamic rulers. But anyway, so Arab superiority becomes an increasing issue, and it's reinforced by things like Arabic becoming the official language of the entire caliphate. So up until this point, you had all this Roman territory where they spoke predominantly Greek. You had all this Persian territory, which they obviously spoke Persian. And those were kind of two major regions that everything to do with business and official documentation and administration was all done in those languages. Well, with the Umayyads, Arabic becomes the language of the land across the caliphate. So if you're doing business, if you are, working in the government, you have to know Arab, and all the official documents are written in Arabic. And then another policy that's put into place is the coinage is reformed. So all the coins up until this point, the local coins, again, the Romans and the Persians, they used a lot of like imagery and things like that. Well, now official, distinctly Arab and Muslim coinage becomes minted and takes and replaces those other ones. So instead of like imagery and, rulers' faces and stuff on the coins, now you just have like written Arabic text on there. And you've got like the Shahada is written on there, and you have things about Muhammad written around the coins. And is another measure that it's just kind of one block at a time, kind of building this base of power to just keep the Arab society on top. So Mawalis are, again, the non-Muslim converts to Islam. And with that, there's supposed to be certain benefits that come. So if you're serving in the military, you're supposed to get a fair share of any of the spoils that they win. Or you're supposed to be able to, enjoy all the rights and privileges that Arab Muslims enjoy. Well, the Mawalis are being kept away from the powerful positions of society. So they're forced to serve in the army, but they can't become generals or high-ranking officers or officials in the government. They're kept out of the cavalry a lot of the times. They're being made to just be foot soldiers and all kinds of things that just continue to create this resentment. And another big thing that was a slap in the face to the Mawalis was the fact that they oftentimes were not even paid the military stipend. So there's this system going on where, standing Muslim armies were supposed to be getting paid, essentially. Well, a lot of times they wouldn't get paid, or they would get a lesser cut of this regular pay compared to their, Arab by birth or Muslim by birth, superiors, I guess. Well, also, they oftentimes, so when you became a Muslim, you were supposed to not have to pay the jizya, which was a special tax that only conquered peoples had to pay, that the dhimmis, the conquered, the people of the book have to pay. Well, a lot of these Mawalis were being made to still pay jizya, at least for a few years, if not just indefinitely, even though they had converted to Islam. So that was another very sore spot. And this and other policies just really create a lot of bad blood that set the kindling that ultimately became the fire of the Abbasid revolution. So with that revolution came the promise that Mawalis would be treated as full Muslims, just like they should have been. But let's talk about dhimmis for a second. So the people of the book, again, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, there may be one or two other ones thrown in there as well. This is the bottom tier of society. So dhimmitude was this system that was put into place. So we kind of saw, it's mentioned in the Quran with, talking about how non-believers, how the people of the book, the Muslims have to go fight them until they either convert to Islam or they agree to pay the tax, which is jizya. It's a special tax that only dhimmis have to pay, or should be only dhimmis paying. Excuse me. Well, there are additional restrictions that come to be put into place because another key component is that people who aren't converting to Islam are supposed to be kind of pressured to incentivize them to, whether that's through economic opportunities or, full freedom, full rights of, Muslims. It's all about limiting the influence of other religions. So you'll see a lot of scholarship will talk about the caliphate had this system of tolerance and, a lot of these people got to continue their lives as normal, and maybe some did. And it certainly wasn't always the same everywhere and not all through all of Islamic history. So we've already talked about Umar, the second caliph. There was what was called Umar's assurance. So when he showed up to the city of Jerusalem to accept their surrender, they signed an agreement that came to be known as Umar's assurance, which, basically said that, okay, the Christians and the Jews can continue to practice their religions, but, it basically guaranteed they had to pay jizya. It laid down some basic terms, but did still leave them a lot of rooms to kind of police themselves, so long as they didn't, get into conflict with Muslims and so on and so forth. Well, there is another Umar. So there's something called the Pact of Umar, which is another document that is sometimes attributed to the second caliph, but it's the sources, they can't find it any earlier than about the 8th century. So the original Umar would have been in the 7th century. So they think the Pact of Umar actually was more closely related to, if not a direct product of, Umar II, which ruled during the period of the Umayyads in the 8th century and in the late 7th and early 8th century. The Pact of Umar is a more strict system. There's a lot more of regulations that begin to be put into place for dhimmis. So it's not just jizya, but let me just read off a few of these. You are no longer allowed to build new churches. You may not even be allowed to repair the ones you're currently using. So your churches that you have at the moment that this goes into effect are just going to continue to deteriorate until you no longer have a place to worship. There are to be no public displays of crosses, religious symbols, or books in Muslim areas or markets. No loud ringing of bells or clappers, and religious processions are kept discreet. No teaching the Quran to non-Muslim children. So there's something set aside so they're not required to teach the Quran to their own Christian or Jewish children. But there is no public manifestation of religion or attempts to convert Muslims. So you can't proselytize. You can't go around and be a preacher on the street. And there's a lot of social distinctions that come to be put into place. So dhimmis would have to defer to Muslims. They would have to give them the right of way. If Muslims were walking down the street, they would have to walk off on the very side of the street. They would have to get up out of their chair and offer it to a Muslim. If a Muslim walked in the room and wanted to sit down, and they couldn't dress like Muslims, so they had a particular manner of dress, which identified them, and sometimes even got to the point where they were wearing certain colors. So I want to say Christians wore like blue or something like that, and Jews had to wear yellow or something. I can't remember exactly which color was which, but in certain times and places they were made to wear like specific colors or just certain items. They would maybe have to shave like the front of their hair to make their hair look more ridiculous. They couldn't use Muslim names or manners of speech. Couldn't carry weapons, which of course, if you're subjecting people, you don't want them to have weapons. and they couldn't ride the same animals and couldn't ride those animals the same way. So whereas a Muslim might be able to ride a horse or a camel, a Christian would have to be limited to a donkey, and he may not even be able to be allowed to ride that donkey normally, where you're sitting like straddled over it. He would have to ride side straddle, so both legs over one side. All these things and more to just, over time, just apply that pressure. And of course, you don't have certain, so like you can't, usually dhimmis wouldn't be allowed to testify in court against a Muslim. So you just don't get a legal defense, or you don't get to participate in the legal system like that. And not all these were necessarily in place all at one time, but this is the system that is developing. And a lot of these policies are starting to be in place in the Umayyads. So not so much at the beginning, as Muawiyah, the first caliph of the Umayyad dynasty, is relying on a lot of these converts and a lot of these dhimmis even to keep the empire running, to fill a lot of the positions that they had already been in when they were conquered. Well, now as time goes on and these other caliphs are taking over, and there's now becoming generations of Muslims, they are occupying more of those upper positions, and the dhimmis and even the muwalis are getting pushed further and further down the social ladder until they are second and third class citizens. So this also, there's a lot of debate. So obviously the caliphate, this system of discrimination, is not unique in history to the Islamic Caliphate. There were obviously many other nations through history. Really, just about every nation at some point in its history had some kind of oppressive system like this. But there is this myth that is peddled that, it was a remarkably, peaceful and tolerant society for all these people. Well, to a point. And some leaders were more tolerant than others. But if there was a war going on, or there was particular economic woes going on, there was a lot of bad things that would happen. So you would be walking on thin ice. If you broke any of these rules, your protections went away, and you could be punished severely, even to the point of death. There are even instances of forced conversions where, people just get sick of tolerating these people, and they force them to convert to Islam. Now, it wasn't necessarily widespread, because really this system is effective because, as we mentioned, it wasn't that these Muslim armies were conquering Christian territory, but they weren't converting everyone by the sword as they went. They were just installing themselves as the rulers, putting this system in place, and then really over the years, the decades, and even the centuries, more and more of the population gradually becomes Muslim over time. And because this steady pressure is just there to make people want to go, well, screw this, man, this sucks. So, yeah, so that is dhimmis in a nutshell. But they do enjoy certain protections. So dhimmis are not required to serve in the military, for example. I don't know that this is really a benefit, but Muslims can marry dhimmi women, but dhimmi men cannot marry Muslim women. The goal here is to always keep Islam on top. That is caked into the system. And this is Sharia. So even today, a fully implemented system of Sharia is going to resemble this. Not necessarily every single line there, but if they have and depending on the particular school, which we're going to talk about here in just a second, this is kind of what you begin to have to deal with. This is what reality under Muslim rule looks like. And even today in countries like, for example, Saudi Arabia, which unsurprisingly to a degree, because Saudi Arabia is where Mecca and Medina is. So it's the Muslim Holy Land, for lack of better terms. And it's really not a lack of better terms. It's pretty accurate. But there is strict rules against people being allowed to proselytize. Like you can't proselytize. You can't have crosses on your churches facing outward. Like you have to keep it all very private, or even within your own home. And you can face some very severe punishments. And of course, we already mentioned in previous episodes talking about apostates. So if you are a Muslim or you've converted to Islam, you better never leave, because some of these countries will give you very severe consequences if you ever do. And certain ones may even kill you for it. But that is, it's definitely a new system to a degree. So I'm not going to say for the time period, I'm not going to say it was the worst system necessarily, because there definitely was other nations that oppressed, even, what's supposed to be Christian nations that would oppress people. The Eastern Roman Empire at times would be very harsh with even other Christians that they thought were not true Christians, but were in fact heretics. They would suffer, heavy taxation and, not being allowed to practice their religion as they wish to, and would even have to be, pressured to recant their heretical beliefs. So it's not that this was entirely unique to Islam, but something that always sticks out in my mind is over history, we see those systems in quote unquote Christian nations gradually diminish and ultimately go away. It never really goes away in Islamic countries. You do have secular nations today, but even in those secular nations, if they have a Muslim majority population, you'll still see little semblances of some of these policies. So like I mentioned before, you have Turkey, which is supposed to be a secular nation, but it is 99% Muslim. And it's hard to be a non-Muslim in that country. There is, I think one of the major Orthodox Christian seminaries is there in the country of Turkey. And it has been closed since like the 70s because of the pressure from the authorities. And there you have to go through systems of registering and getting approved by the government to exist. You have a lot of the same restrictions, like you can't proselytize to Muslims and things like that in otherwise secular nations. So, but let's move on. So we got a couple other things to talk about. You start to see Muslim art develop in this time period, particularly architecture. So this period's kind of challenging because there's not a lot in terms of primary sources. So we only know so much, and a lot of what we do know is actually from the Abbasids, which came after them, which did not like the Umayyads. So it's hard to know what all is just them being smeared and what is them reporting accurately. But they do leave a couple of very significant constructions. In fact, you're going to already recognize one of them. The Dome of the Rock, which sits on the Temple Mount in the city of Jerusalem to this very day, that golden domed, blue-walled mosque building, that was constructed by the Umayyads. And it was a very powerful statement of not just, Islamic architecture and art that has been developing, as it's kind of blending Byzantine and Persian styles and including their own themes. But it's also them building that there was a powerful statement to the Christians and Jews to kind of really assert Islam's dominance over them. So it's sitting on top of the Temple Mount where the Jewish temple used to sit. And that still exists to this day. And then it's also just, a very visible statement to Christians who still had churches and stuff in the area, even the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was there at the time, this bigger complex there over the traditional site of Christ's resurrection. You have this, it's this very prominent feature that, sits above, a lot of the rest of the city. So it's just kind of a constant reminder of Islam's dominance. And then you also have things, one thing I forgot to mention is the center of power moves from Medina up into Damascus, Syria, because that's what, Muawiyah was the governor of Syria. That's where a lot of his supporters and his base is. So during his rule, he moves the capital to Damascus, and it sits in Damascus through, I think, the entirety of this period into the Abbasids as they come into power. And there's what's called the Great Mosque of Damascus is also constructed in, obviously, the city of Damascus during this time. That's a major building project that still stands to this day. And some of the style, so Muslim style relies a lot more on, so they try to kind of diminish, if not omit entirely, imagery, particularly like images of faces, because they don't want to cross the line into idolatry. So you may get depictions of like trees and bushes and things like that. And there are depictions of people here and there, but you will see very prevalently, there's going to be a lot of geometric designs, a lot of uses of like specific like archways, domes, minarets, And a lot of another thing is they have a particular focus on courtyards. So the outer, what faces the street, that side of the building may, only have so much attention paid to it. But the courtyard, the inside, this may be this big, beautiful open area, very decorated, lots of beautiful colors. And this is a particular feature that develops in Islamic architecture, because it's just kind of I can't remember the exact reasons for that, but it is kind of a distinguishing feature, among other things. So this is all beginning under the Umayyads, and it'll continue to develop over the centuries to come. So as we're getting close to the end here, I want to spend just a moment talking about kind of some of the religious development during this time. So way back, and I believe it was episode 2, I mentioned different schools of Islam. So Sharia is essentially the Islamic code of law applied. It's applied Islam. And it obviously governs the lives of Muslims, but it also governs, in an Islamic nation, everyone else's lives as well. So there's certain lives, and the whole dhimmi system is part of that. It's part of Sharia when it is implemented. Well, there are different schools of thought that have developed over time on the right way to, or the preferred way to apply this system of, and like what particular documents you focus on, or what particular sources you focus more on how to apply kind of the method. So, Sharia is the system applied, but there's different kind of ways and styles of how you go about doing that. So Sunnis, the majority of Muslims in the world, have 4 major schools, and 2 of them, their founders are born and live and even start producing a lot of their work, or one of them produces most of his work, during this time, during the Umayyads. And that is the Maliki school, which was founded on the teachings of Imam Malik ibn Anas, who was born in Medina and spent most of his life in Medina and ruled as a jurist there. He studied and was a Muslim scholar, and helped actually produce considered one of the most authoritative collections of hadiths, of traditions and sayings and teachings of Muhammad, to this very day, called Al-Muwatta, which is translated to mean the well-trodden path. So, and this is one of the tippy top here. So, just to kind of give you a little bit more clarity on what I mean. So, this school of thought is named after him. So it's the Maliki school. It relies heavily, something that's kind of more unique about it, relies heavily on the kind of the lifestyle and the practices and the traditions of the people of Medina, where Muhammad lived for the latter section of his life. And the reason is because he figured, okay, well, if they lived under Muhammad's leadership for decades, here we are not that long removed after. So he was born in 711, not Muhammad, Malik. He was born in 711 and lived until 795. So here he is less than a century removed from Muhammad at the time of his birth. And so the Medinans are believed to live their lives much how Muhammad taught them. So it kind of reinforces a lot of these sayings that he's collecting and putting into this book and other works that he's putting together. So the Maliki school is a little more flexible. It's not super strict. So remember, any of these schools, you've got this kind of hierarchy. So the Quran for all of them, and these are all orthodox. They agree with, none of them are changing like the basic pillars of Islam. None of them are changing like the major teachings. It's just wherever there's wiggle room, they kind of take it slightly different directions. So, but all of them are going to have the Quran at the top and the Sunnah right underneath that. So the Sunnah is all the Hadith and all that. Then you get basically reason and analogy are the next 2, and that's the main 4 there. So the Maliki school is one of those that uses a little bit more of that kind of that wiggle room with the I wrote less strict, more flexible, easier to adapt across a variety of conquered cultures, which is probably why it became so prevalent, because today 25% of Muslims fall underneath this school in the world. And it became useful in this time period because with such a rapid acquisition of so many different, nations and territories and stuff, they had to find ways to apply Sharia in these new places and to do so effectively. So Maliki and the other school that develops, which is the Hanafi school, which is the largest school to this day, these are both a little bit more flexible systems, and they give a little bit more. The Hanafi school in particular gives a little bit more preference for the kind of the local rulers to kind of take into account things like local customs and see how that can mesh with the Islamic laws. And it kind of the power is kind of decentralized a little bit. It's kind of pushed down. The Maliki school is most commonly found in today in North Africa, West Africa, Upper Egypt, so Sudan, and parts of the Gulf, so like Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. This is kind of where it's found most prevalent, where it kind of rules to this day. These countries, their governments, basically this means this is how the governments of these places kind of have their approach on how to include Islam in the rule of their people in their respective countries. Meanwhile, the Hanafi school, which is the most common, so a third of all Muslims in the world fall underneath this school, and it's most prevalent in the country of Turkey, in the Balkan countries in Southeast Europe that are predominantly Muslim, the Central Asian countries, so like I mentioned, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, those kinds of countries, South Asia to include India, Pakistan, which of course India is not a Muslim nation itself, but there's a significant population of Muslims that live there, and they follow this school for the most part. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, the Levant, so this is the most, again, it's the Hanafi school, the biggest school, so you got a lot of countries here that follow it. Syria, Jordan, the Muslims that live around Israel and Palestine, that area, a portion of Iraq, and a lot of Egypt, so all over the place. So those schools really begin to come into being and begin to be practiced under the Umayyads. And then after the Umayyads, when the Abbasids take over, you get the other two major schools come into being with their founders being active not long after the transition from Umayyad to Abbasid. So with that, we have just a couple notable battles that take place. I mentioned a couple earlier with the Siege of Constantinople. In the west, so as the Muslim forces are pushing and beginning to conduct raids and start to invade southern France, there's a battle fought in 721 at the Battle of Toulouse, which kind of hobbles their efforts a little bit. And then there is a big defeat at the Battle of Tours in the year 732, which is 100 years exactly from the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So that is not far from Paris. So that's pretty deep in France, or at least what would one day become France. And those kind of defeats back to back are enough to break the Muslim momentum, and they kind of fall back to and become, for the most part, focused on maintaining their hold on Spain. They'll continue to conduct raids throughout history, and but that really is kept them from pushing deeper in, throughout France and into Germany or into Italy and all those places. In the east, not just the failed siege of Constantinople in 717 and 718, but later you have the Romans actually finally score a major victory in the field and crush Muslim forces at the Battle of Akroinon in the year 740. I probably mispronounced that. Akroinon. But this is the first significant Roman victory against the Muslims in open battle, not just in the defense of Constantinople, but out into the field, like I mentioned. And that kind of spells the beginning of the end for the Umayyads, because it was just a few years after that the Abbasids overthrew them. that was going to be it for today. I appreciate you guys. Sorry if it was a little scatterbrained at points, but I hope it was beneficial for you. Next week, we're going to talk about at least the Abbasids, and I really appreciate you guys coming back to the channel, and we will see you next time.